Radiohead are a rare and unique type of band. They've been able to become one of the most popular and successful commercially and critically bands of the last 30 years, while still being able to pump out complex and challenging music. They're equally as popular with festival goers as they are with critics and virtuoso musicians, and that's part of their appeal and their longevity. It's their constant need to evolve their sound. Every Radiohead project sounds distinct from one another, and you can see that when people try to categorize and pinpoint exactly what type of music it is that Radiohead make. Is it alternative rock? Is it art pop? Is it experimental, electronic, yada, yada, yada? It's all of them and none of them at the same time. All 9 of their albums are pretty different from one another, with the band reinventing themselves at each junction. Most Radiohead fans like myself have different opinions about the strongest album, the weakest album, the most underrated album, etc. And we'll get to those as we go down this list. At no surprise to any, the least controversial pick is to have Pablo Honey rock bottom of this list. Mainly because Pablo Honey is an album of its time, so to speak. It came out when Radiohead hadn't quite yet carved their own niche and identity and sound. You haven't got most of the things that people associate with a Radiohead project today, and with the benefit of hindsight and looking back and comparing it to the rest of their discography, it can sound comparatively rudimentary. But looking at it solely through the lens of their later work can detract from some of the merits that Pablo Honey has. It was clear to see that these were highly skilled, highly talented musicians. It's just that the songs that they were pumping out were kind of generic, middle of the road. Songs like Stop Whispering or Vegetable sound like an amalgamation of the alternative rock grunge sounds that were very popular in the early 90s, especially over in America. However, the potential, I think, was there from the outset, and I think there are some very underrated tunes on Pablo Honey. Blowout, for me, is a prime Radiohead song. Tom York sings about his struggles with identity and self-esteem whilst drawing some parallels to mythology, and that's something that would continue the further they got down their career. It's much more restrained and subtle than most of the songs on the album, and that's a characteristic that they would run with throughout their career. Of course, this album features Creep. Bizarrely, it still remains Radiohead's most recognizable song 28 years after its release. It's kind of a meme at this point, with it being well documented that the band aren't particularly fond of the song anymore, and I can kind of understand that. When you look back at the lyrics, it can make you cringe at times. The self-awareness of the titular Creep doesn't detract from how frankly pathetic this character comes across as. Regardless of its flaws, I do still enjoy the song and a decent portion of the album, despite how unrepresentative of their overall sound Pablo Honey is. The King of Limbs may be one of the most divisive records in Radiohead's discography. It's the shortest, it's got the most unconventional structure, and it's the album where they sound least like a band. The King of Limbs is an experiment in sampling and looping work. It focuses on sampling and intricate rhythms rather than flashy guitar work or melodies. Tom York has been for a long period of time an admirer of artists like DJ Shadow or like Aphex Twin, and those artists greatly influenced albums like Kid A, but I feel The King of Limbs is where he truly got to experiment in this world, in this sound. Whether those experiments worked or not, I think is entirely subjective. The lyrics are almost as abstract as Kid A, with a lot of wildlife and nature imagery making up a bulk of the lyrics. More so than any other Radiohead album, the focus is on feeling and rhythm rather than any truly tangible concept. I think it really works where they toe the line ever so carefully between inorganic and natural, and I think they do that best on the first song, Bloom. The percussion is odd and it's chopped and you don't quite know where to nod your head, and then Tom York brings one of his most expressive vocal performances ever. The same could be said about the crazy rhythms and vocal samples on Feral or the piano and 808s on Codex. I believe that this album isn't held in the same high regard or esteem as other Radiohead albums because it can sound inorganic at times. In turn, that can make it sound calculated and lacking that human element that makes Radiohead's music so great. Not to say that some of the moments on the album aren't moving or that they don't conjure emotion, because I think they do, just not to the same extent or in the same manner as other projects. I must preface this by saying that from this position onwards, every single album is one that I love. Having this album this low might be controversial because I'm aware of how widely beloved it is. It's more a reflection of how much I love the other albums in this list rather than me particularly disliking Hail to the Thief. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Hail to the Thief is actually the first time I ever heard a Radiohead song, and that's because of one specific tune. Mixomatosis sounded so familiar to me the first time I sat down and listened to Hail to the Thief, but I couldn't rack my brain and I couldn't place my finger on where I'd heard the song before. And then I realized that I'd heard it as a child, as like a 7 or an 8-year-old, on FIFA 2004, the one that's got Henry and Ronaldinho and Del Piero on the front cover. Even back then, I thought, this doesn't sound like a traditional FIFA song, and I still think that that's true today. However, with hindsight and with me being able to kind of comprehend what's actually going on in the song as an adult, I think this is one of the most sophisticatedly written songs on the album. The imagery of this mongrel cat holding a severed head, and it serving as a metaphor for the relationship between being an artist and being in the limelight, being in the media all the time, is genius to me. The only reason I think I have Hail to the Thief at number 7 rather than higher up is because I'm one of those people that just happens to prefer conceptual, more abstract Radiohead than reactive political Radiohead. Hail to the Thief is by far the album that is most shaped by contemporary events that were happening at the time of its release. It came out in 2003, so we were just post 9/11. There was a new Bush administration. There was the war on terror. There was what was going on here with Tony Blair and New Labour. And more so than on any other record, Hail to the Thief has almost every iteration of Radiohead that there has ever been. The Gloaming was originally conceived in the recording sessions for Kid A, and that's so easy to hear because it sounds more Kid A than some of the songs on Kid A. The only difference is that the lyrics on The Gloaming are a far more overt call to action than anything that appears on Kid A. Go to Sleep, which is one of my personal favourite Radiohead songs, could fit quite snugly into the OK Computer track list. It's folky, it's breezy, but it's got that unnerving mood lurking in the background thanks to Johnny Greenwood. The anti-war message of the song is beautifully written, and it's all the more impressive when you learn that the lyrics that you get in Go to Sleep were originally written as just placeholders intended to be replaced later. Individually as songs, most of what's on this album is extremely good, better than good in fact, but it's the one project that feels least like an album, to me at least, because so much of it is wildly different from each other. But that's the only flaw for me, whether it's the super jazzy We Suck Young Blood or the insanely sarcastic A Punch Up at a Wedding. There's something for every type of Radiohead fan on Hail to the Thief. The Benz is where I believe Radiohead finally started to find their signature sound. And of course, this is a project that is very heavily influenced still by the sounds of the 90s, but it's developed enough and distinct enough to not be generic. That's apparent by the opening song, Planet Telex. This is the one song that I think is a perfect preview of what was to come further down the line, especially as a preview for OK Computer. Everything on the Benz has a distinctly melancholic filter over it rather than the angst and anger of Pablo Honey. Tom York had started writing more conceptual, observational songs as well, rather than insular confessional songs. Fake Plastic Trees, for example, is a very mature exploration on the relationship between consumerism and relationships. It's also one of those songs that exists solely in this transitionary period. It's not grungy like the songs on Pablo Honey, but it hasn't got that electronic influence that we got on OK Computer. It's of its time in the same kind of way that Pablo Honey was, but with just that added originality. That may be the only downside of this album, and that is that it's so quintessentially a 90s album. The mid to late 90s saw a slow, gradual shift away from the grunge aesthetics of the early 90s into something a bit moodier and a bit more contemplative, and Radiohead were at the forefront of that. The Benz is also quite cohesive as an album listening experience. There's enough variation and variety between the tracks to not get boring. Sometimes there's variation in just songs, like on Just. But at the same time, every song has its place and they all fit together very neatly. Dread was the one emotion I don't think they had quite explored fully yet until they got to the final song, Street Spirit. For me, Street Spirit is one of the most depressing songs that Radiohead have ever recorded. It's all about the inevitability of death, the futility of life, and anxiety about the sheer weight of merely existing. It also started a trend of Thom Yorke using these big, grand concepts to draw parallels to his personal life, as well as Radiohead as artists. Street Spirit as the closing song for me is perfect. It's a little window into what was to come later in their career. Kid A's Little Sister, the companion piece, the one that people sometimes like to refer as the B-size record. But I must stress that Amnesiac is different enough from Kid A and good enough as well to be rewarded on its own merits. Kid A is usually referred to as the point where Radiohead completely transformed their sound as the new millennium came in, and I do think that that is true. However, I would argue that at points, Amnesiac can be even more challenging and patience testing than Kid A. There's just as much of the electronic ambient influence on here, but with an even greater emphasis on using jazz aesthetics and sounds. But they do remedy that with a sprinkling of more traditional songs as well. Polk, Pull Revolving Doors is one of my favorite songs on Amnesiac, but I can easily understand why it might be someone's least favorite. The pitch-shifted vocals, just like on the title track to Kid A, are love them or hate them. Personally, I love this song for just how unnerving and menacing and dark and brooding it sounds. Compare this to a song like Knives Out, for example, and they sound worlds apart. Again, it's one of my favorites on the album, but it's one of the few guitar-driven alternative rock songs on here. However, even though it's structured a bit more traditionally than some of the other songs, I find it just as unsettling as most of the other songs on Amnesiac, and that is because of the violent imagery. Now, I don't think that Knives Out is a particularly violent song, literally, but Thom Yorke has in the past used violent imagery to describe a world of societal inequalities. It's kind of like a false sense of security because it sounds familiar, but there's something menacing and darker lurking underneath. Lyrically, I find Amnesiac more daunting than Kid A, and I think that's maybe why I don't return to it as much as I return to other albums. But when I do return to Amnesiac, I usually find myself playing the entire thing from start to finish. It's all-consuming, and I think it's the most haunting album. I think that's the word to describe it. It's the most haunting Radiohead album. I think all you have to do is listen to the unconventional structure and dimensional lyrics of Pyramid Song to get that sense. Although I don't believe that Amnesiac is as good as Kid A, I think they serve completely different purposes and they can't exactly be compared.
Wake from your sleep.
I know that this is probably the most popular choice for not just Radiohead's best album, but one of the best rock albums ever made. And I do agree that this is one of the best albums ever made. I just happen to think that the other three on this list are even better. OK Computer is widely praised for both its musicality and how accurately it appeared to predict what was to come in the 21st century. Particularly the rise of new technologies and how that fed into feelings of anxiety and isolation. OK Computer is an album that I think has aged amazingly well, with some of the lyrics being particularly pertinent to what has been going on in the last couple of years. Especially when I go back and listen to songs like Electioneering or Subterranean Homesick Alien, I'm like, that's about now, that's today. Alongside the socially and politically inspired lyrics, OK Computer also saw a leaning towards more abstract and conceptual lyrics as well. And some of these more abstract songs would counterintuitively go on to become some of Radiohead's biggest ever hits. People still debate as to what exactly Karma Police is about. Is the narrator in the Karma Police? Is he a subject of the Karma Police? Is the Karma Police evil? Is it a force for good? I think the one thing that's kind of agreed upon about Karma Police is that it's an overtly anti-capitalist song. Regardless of its interpretation, Karma Police remains a fan favorite for very good reason. It's a sprawling song, and like so much of the album, it explores these anti-capitalist messages through quite violent imagery, but also with a lot of self-awareness. Your Opinion, which is of no consequence, is about Radiohead, to me, about artists, about how a capitalist society places money over everything, especially art. That's why I say so many of these songs are relevant today, even more so than they were back in 1997. During the current pandemic last year, our government quite unambiguously told people who work in creative fields to simply retrain. Almost every song is a standout for very different reasons. Exit music for a film is one of the saddest songs ever written, in my opinion. No Surprises is equally as sad, but for very different reasons. It's all about accepting the mundane aspects of your life. Airbag, Let Down, The Tourist, it's a flawless track list, in my opinion. Radiohead's most recent release, and with this release they showed that even after nearly 3 decades in the game, they can still perform at the very highest level. What impressed me the most, and still does to this day, is that for a band that has made their name making moody, down-tempo, dreary music, in the latter stages of their career, they bring out their moodiest and saddest album ever, and they still sound as fresh as they ever did. Not to mention, a handful of these songs had been circulating for years prior to the release of A Moon-Shaped Pool, most notably Burn the Witch and True Love Waits. I do find A Moon-Shaped Pool more emotionally driven and emotionally rich than most of their projects. It's still as existential and moody as any other Radiohead album, but it comes with a subtlety and a maturity that can only come as a byproduct of aging. This album could not have been made at any other point in Radiohead's career. Burn the Witch, lyrically, would have fit perfectly on an album like Hail to the Thief. It's a song all about scapegoating and the dangers of crowd mentality and groupthink. It would have been extremely timely if it dropped in 2003. But 2016 was a shit show. We had Brexit, we had the migrant crisis in the EU, we had the election of Donald Trump, we had the rise of the so-called alt-right. Lyrically, this is the most timely song that Radiohead have ever released. Musically, the sequenced drums and steady strings build into this steady rhythm until you get to the final portion where it all disintegrates and it sounds like the gates of hell are opening up. That ability to conjure such vivid emotions is what makes this album special for me, and that happens sometimes before you even get to any lyrical content. The hauntingly ambient Daydreaming is one of the most emotionally affecting songs that they've ever made. Like so much of Radiohead's music, Daydreaming has moments of immense euphoric highs that are interjected with dissonant unease. Even something as relatively straightforward as a piano ballad has something darker under the surface. So much of this album for me is about looking back, sometimes with disappointment, sometimes with just acceptance. And that's why I think that the idea of aging is so important and integral to A Moon-Shaped Pool. Full Stop, for example, sounds like the end of an unhealthy, toxic relationship, and I'm aware that different iterations of this song had existed before Tom York's divorce to his late wife, but I do think that idea of only just now realizing why you entered a relationship after its violent end, I think that idea is still in there. This album is like the opposite of having rose-tinted glasses. It's like having grey-tinted glasses. It's just as consistent as any other Radiohead album, in my opinion. Immediately after Full Stop, you get the super dramatic and depressing Glass Eyes. Then you get the more traditionally structured but nonetheless amazing Identikit. And then you get the folk climate change song The Numbers. Although by far it's their saddest album to date, there's still enough in there to satisfy most Radiohead fans. And I think that's why A Moon-Shaped Pool is one of their most underrated albums as well. Kid A is without a doubt the album that changed the trajectory of Radiohead's career forever. Off the back of OK Computer, which was heralded as the best rock album of the 90s and one of the best rock records of all time, Tom York was burnt out, particularly struggling with writer's block and the stress of the insane touring schedule. That resulted in one of the sharpest left turns in popular music history. Largely devoid of guitars or even traditional instrumental lineups, no singles or music videos, very little promotion, and they use the internet as a tool for marketing. Everything about Kid A was different. Now, I must stress that I don't believe that Kid A is one of the most experimental, musically challenging albums ever to be made, but when you place it in the context of who Radiohead were at the time, they were one of the biggest bands on planet Earth. It was immensely challenging for some fans. The opening song, Everything in Its Right Place, is a statement of intent. They were backmasking Tom York's vocals. They had super cryptic lyrics about waking up sucking a lemon. They had left behind being labelled a rock band on Everything in Its Right Place. As far as I'm aware, Phil Selway and Ed O'Brien do not contribute a single thing. Kid A established that Radiohead were no longer a rock band. They were something different, and in my opinion, something bigger than that. Just like the album artwork, so much of this album is a jagged, scary marriage of the organic and synthetic worlds coming together. How to Disappear Completely is a perfect example of this. I like to think that the ever-present dissonant strings lurking in the background of this song is kind of like the auditory equivalent of living with depression. It's always there, lurking in the corner, and you can't quite ignore it. The strummed guitars and bass want to take the lead, but the strings win in the end, although it does end with a surprising euphoric high. Songs like the title track or Tree Fingers especially are some of the most challenging songs that Radiohead has ever put out. Idiotech is a fan favourite for very good reason. The sampling, the intricate rhythms, Tom York's apocalyptic lyrics. This has remained a personal favourite of mine since the very first day I heard it. Even on an album like this, there is still something for everyone. Songs like In Limbo or Optimistic are more traditionally structured songs, whilst still maintaining that creepiness and otherworldly nature that makes a Kid A song a Kid A song. Just like OK Computer, I think Kid A has aged amazingly well. Kid A is the reality that was prophesized on OK Computer, and I think that's why, for me at least personally, I think they work quite well as companion pieces. In Rainbows was the very first Radiohead album I ever heard when I was about 15 years old. I fell in love immediately with it, and it's what made me a Radiohead fan, so it was always going to be my number one. Putting my personal bias aside for one moment, I think In Rainbows is their most personal album. It's the most transcendent, it's euphoric at times as well, and it's the least overtly political. However, it's super concerned with death and failed relationships, and on paper, it would make it an even drearier album than A Moon-Shaped Pool. But these concepts are communicated in a kind of seductive way that don't make them immediately apparent. Like on 15 Step, this character refers to death as something that's not necessarily a negative thing or a bad thing. They just acknowledge it and accept it with assurance. Aside from the lyrics of 15 Step, there's so much to love about the song. The programmed drums that are in 5/4, the warm guitar tones, the fucking bass line, that's my favourite bass line on a Radiohead song ever. So many of the ideas that were explored on OK Computer and Kid A make their way onto In Rainbows. Isolation, dissatisfaction, death, anxiety. But instead of searching for meaning or for a reason for why these things are happening or why I feel the way I do, In Rainbows focuses on the human element, on the emotion in real time. Nude, for example, lyrically, is not really new territory. It's all about one's ambition just being crushed and finding out that whatever it is that you were chasing for all this time is not going to fulfill you or satisfy you. I find this song really tragic because I can imagine that these emotions that Tom York is singing about is exactly what he must have been picturing as a young teenager or a kid wanting to be a famous, successful musician. Yet, there's still something missing. It's that acceptance of a reality that forms the emotional bedrock for In Rainbows. It's not concerned with the why, it's not concerned with the how, it's just concerned with the is. Weird Fishes is my personal favourite Radiohead song ever, and I think the reason it's remained that way for so many years is that I've constantly found its meaning to me changing over the years. It's like a metaphysical relationship with reality itself, but you can still apply these lyrics to a physical human relationship. Aside from the lyrics, musically, it's next level. It builds and builds and builds through these arpeggiated guitars, and as Tom York describes being eaten by the worms, it all drops out before transitioning into a new section of song that is just super, super euphoric. The track list is also super tight. It's just over 40 minutes. There's only 10 songs. There's no single second of filler. Towards the end of the album, you get Reckoner, then you get Jigsaw Falling into Place, then House of Cards, then Videotape. It's fucking perfect, mate! Speaking of Videotape, this is the song that is the most concerned with death that I've ever heard Tom York. This is the song I would point to argue that In Rainbows is an album of acceptance. Tom York doesn't question why he has to die or why he has to leave behind all these things that he loves. He's made peace with it and he's accepted the reality of it, even if it might be sad. It's such a specific feeling of bittersweetness that they capture with this song. The protagonist is grateful for even having the opportunity to be alive and taking comfort in the small things in life, like the last day on this planet being the most perfect day he's ever seen. Emotionally, In Rainbows stands tall as the most vivid and colourful album in Radiohead's discography. Because what these songs mean to me and their meaning has constantly evolved and changed, and I always find something new going back to this album, I think that's the reason why it is my number one. I know most Radiohead fans are going to have wildly differing lists, so if you care to do so, leave your list in the comments down below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and dong the bell, and I shall see you next time. I had to do it to him.